What happens after the empire falls? But the queen is still alive. Cleopatra did not die the moment Egypt fell. She lived through what came after, and what came after was not chaos, it was not rage, it was not revenge, it was administration. In August of 30 BC, Roman soldiers entered the royal palace in Alexandria. They did not come to execute her. They came to preserve her, not as a sovereign, not as an ally, not even as an enemy, but as an asset. Doors were sealed. Guards were stationed at every threshold. Messengers were screened. Objects were catalogued and removed. The war had ended. Her captivity had begun. What happened in those final weeks was not a dramatic race toward poison or serpents. It was a process calculated, procedural, and designed to achieve something more complete than death. Rome did not simply defeat rulers, it redefined them. When Octavian's forces entered Alexandria on August 1st, 30 BC, the city surrendered without siege. No walls were breached, no fires consumed the harbor. The transition was bureaucratic. Rome preferred paperwork to rubble when possible. Cleopatra remained inside her palace. But the palace was no longer hers. Roman units arrived in disciplined formation. They did not storm the building, they occupied it. Entrances were reassigned. Interior routes were mapped. Observation points were established. Certain rooms were sealed. Others were cleared. Guards were posted not to protect her, but to monitor her. Ancient sources described the placement of sentries at measured intervals. Plutarch records that soldiers were instructed to prevent any act of self-harm. Cassius notes that food was inspected before delivery. Sharp objects were removed. Mirrors were taken. Cosmetics were searched. Fabrics were examined for hidden implements. This was not detention. It was containment with intent. Cleopatra was allowed movement, but only within designated areas. She could speak to attendants, if those attendants were approved. She could send messages if those messages were reviewed. She could request items if those items were cleared. Every action required permission. Every permission was delayed. The palace still contained her belongings. Her furniture remained in place. Her garments were accessible, but the structure itself had been reclassified. It was no longer a seat of power. It was a controlled environment. Outside the palace, Alexandria continued functioning. Markets operated. Temples opened. Grain shipments were processed. Roman administrators began cataloging tax records, mapping property boundaries, interviewing local officials. Egypt was not being destroyed. It was being absorbed inside. Time slowed. Cleopatra was not executed, not tortured, not interrogated. She was maintained. Days passed without resolution. She sent requests to meet Octavian. They were acknowledged but not answered. Letters were delivered but responses were delayed. Proposals were submitted but decisions were postponed. Rome did not reject her. It processed her. This delay was strategic. Roman power operated through procedural dominance. Outcomes were shaped not by confrontation, but by the management of time. Every unanswered message reinforced a single reality. She could no longer initiate action. Her daily routine dissolved into irregularity. Meals arrived at inconsistent intervals. Attendance rotated without pattern. Requests were logged but fulfillment was suspended. The architecture she had known for decades transformed into a map of restriction. Corridors once open were closed. Chambers once ceremonial were emptied. Spaces once associated with authority were stripped of symbolism. This was not imprisonment in chains. It was spatial redefinition. Cleopatra had governed Egypt for 21 years. She had negotiated with Julius Caesar. She had stood beside Mark Antony before assembled fleets. She had commanded resources that fed half the Mediterranean world. She spoke multiple languages. She understood trade networks, priesthood hierarchies, military logistics. None of that applied now. She could not negotiate with guards who followed orders without deviation. She could not command soldiers who answered to Rome. She could not leverage alliances that had collapsed at Actium. Every instrument she once used, persuasion, delay, strategic generosity, political theater, had been removed from the equation. What remained was her presence, and Rome had calculated the value of that presence. The redefinition of Cleopatra had begun years earlier. After the naval defeat at Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's propaganda machine intensified its efforts. Official communications avoided her royal titles. Public rhetoric described her not as a monarch but as a foreign manipulator. Coins bearing her likeness ceased circulation in Roman territories. Narratives emphasized seduction over statecraft. By the time Alexandria fell, the Roman public had already been conditioned. Cleopatra was no longer pharaoh. She was a cautionary tale. Her capture did not create that narrative. It finalized it. Roman law required spectacle to validate supremacy. Victory was not proclaimed. It was demonstrated. A triumph in Rome followed a strict sequence. First came spoils, then captives, then the defeated leader, displayed in chains before execution or imprisonment. Cleopatra was being preserved for that procession. But preservation required transformation. She could not appear as a rival sovereign. She had to appear as conquered property. Language shifted first. Roman officials stopped addressing her by title. Correspondents referred to her as the Egyptian woman. Diplomatic forms were replaced by instructions for managing detainees. Inside the palace, this shift had material consequences. Royal seals were confiscated. Ceremonial regalia was catalogued. Administrative archives were removed. Anything symbolizing governance was separated from her quarters. Jewelry was inventoried. Clothing was assessed. Even cosmetics were examined not for beauty, but for concealment. She observed the categorization of her own identity. On August 3rd, she was granted an audience with Octavian. The meeting took place within her palace, but the space had been rearranged. Guards lined the entrances. Furniture was repositioned. Scribes stood ready. Octavian entered not with generals, but with record keepers. This was documentation. Cleopatra attempted justification. She explained her alliance with Antony as political necessity. She presented financial records. She offered treasury access. She requested assurances for her children. Octavian listened. He did not refuse, he did not accept, he acknowledged. Then he left. The meeting lasted less than an hour. No agreements were formalized. No timeline was disclosed. But its purpose was achieved. It allowed Cleopatra to believe negotiation remained possible. As long as she believed that, she would wait. And waiting ensured stability. While she waited, Rome prepared. Her eldest son, Caesarion, publicly acknowledged as Julius Caesar's biological child, posed a unique threat. His existence complicated Octavian's claim to inheritance. A living son of Caesar could destabilize the political narrative forming in Rome. Caesarion 17 had been sent away before Alexandria fell. Accounts differ on whether he returned voluntarily or was intercepted. What remains consistent is his fate. He was executed. The method is unclear. The rationale was not. An advisor reportedly remarked that too many Caesars was dangerous. Caesarion's removal was surgical. It eliminated ambiguity. Cleopatra's younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were not executed. They were reassigned. Rome did not always destroy dynasties. It repurposed them. The children were transported to Rome, raised under supervision, integrated into elite households. Cleopatra Selene would later marry Juba of Mauritania, governing as queen within a Roman framework. Survival was permitted, but autonomy was not. For Cleopatra, this clarified the equation. Her children's safety was no longer negotiable leverage. It was already secured under Roman terms. Her bargaining power dissolved. Meanwhile, preparations in Rome accelerated. Artisans began constructing triumphal displays. Artists drafted imagery of Actium. Inventories of Egyptian treasures were compiled for procession. The queen herself was scheduled as the culminating exhibit. Cleopatra understood Roman triumphs. She knew what happened to defeated rulers. She knew the humiliation of public display preceded ritual execution or lifelong imprisonment. She would not rule again. But she could still decide how she ended. The restrictions around her tightened. After Caesarion's execution, surveillance intensified. Guards rotated more frequently. Visitors were limited further. Personal items were reduced. Rome suspected what she might attempt. Plutarch records that Cleopatra tested her constraints. She feigned illness. She refused food intermittently. She probed for weaknesses in routine. Roman oversight responded immediately. Medical attendants were introduced. Food supervision increased. Time compressed. Octavian had to move carefully. A dead Cleopatra too soon would deny him spectacle. A living Cleopatra too long risked instability. He needed her alive but compliant. Then something shifted. Ancient accounts diverge here, but a consistent theme emerges. Cleopatra realized that Rome intended not execution in Alexandria, but exhibition in Rome. She would not die as a queen. She would be paraded as a symbol. That was unacceptable. On the final day, access tightened further. Guards were posted at increased intervals. Attendants were screened more rigorously. Yet somehow an opportunity emerged. Whether through concealed venom, a hidden instrument, or coordinated assistance from loyal servants, Cleopatra achieved what Rome had attempted to prevent. She removed herself from the sequence. When Roman officials entered her chamber, they found her dead, arranged in royal attire. Octavian reacted not with rage but calculation. Her death disrupted the planned triumph, but it did not dismantle the narrative. Rome adapted quickly. Effigies could substitute for bodies. Imagery could replace presence. Even in death she would be displayed symbolically. Her body was buried with Antony, reportedly according to her wishes. Egypt was annexed as a Roman province. Its wealth redirected to finance Octavian's transformation into Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The Republic ended. The empire began. Cleopatra's final weeks were not defined by drama, but by system. She was not overwhelmed by violence. She was enveloped by procedure. Rome did not merely conquer territory. It reorganized identity. Cleopatra's erasure was administrative before it was physical. Her titles were removed. Her lineage disrupted. Her children reassigned. Her narrative rewritten. Her death prevented humiliation. But it did not prevent absorption. In Rome, Octavian celebrated his triumph in 29 BC. Egyptian spoils were displayed. Images of the defeated queen were paraded. The Roman public witnessed confirmation of supremacy. Cleopatra did not stand in chains behind the chariot. But the outcome was the same. Egypt became imperial property. Its grain fed Roman legions. Its treasury stabilized the regime. Its symbolism reinforced Augustus's authority. Cleopatra's story would survive, but filtered through Roman authors, through Plutarch, through Dio, through poets who served imperial ideology. Her voice did not record the final weeks. Rome did. And Rome described not a sovereign contained by circumstance, but a foreign queen subdued by destiny. Yet beneath the rhetoric lies the pattern. She was not killed immediately because her death alone was insufficient. She was preserved because her existence had strategic value. She was isolated because control required precision. She was delayed because time itself was a weapon. In those final weeks, Cleopatra faced something more relentless than armies. She faced administration. Not chaos, not spectacle, system. And system, once activated, rarely leaves room for negotiation. Her final act, whatever its precise method, was the last decision she controlled. Rome conquered Egypt, but it did not choreograph her ending. And in that narrow margin between occupation and exhibition, Cleopatra chose the only outcome Rome could not fully script.